Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Was there a beginning of the universe? Or does the universe just go back and back forever? Well, typically naturalists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But I think there are good reasons, both philosophically and scientifically, to doubt that this is the case. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past seems to be absurd. Just think about it. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. For example, if you had an infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, and I took away all of the odd-numbered coins, how many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all of the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all of the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet in each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with self-contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer from 0 to infinity. And for this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But while you can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to subtract infinite quantities, you can't prevent people from giving away part of their coins if they want to. This shows, I think, that infinity is just a concept or idea in your mind and not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, states, and I quote, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea," end quote. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the universe can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. And what makes this beginning of the universe so remarkable is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, come into existence at the moment of the Big Bang. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, and I quote, "The coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing," end quote. Now, of course, alternative theories have been offered over the years to try to avoid this absolute beginning. But none of these theories has commended itself to the majority of the scientific community. In fact, in the year 2003, three scientists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. And this Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies not simply to the standard model, but also applies to quantum gravity models, inflationary models of the universe, cyclical models of the universe, and higher dimensional brain cosmologies. Vilenkin pulls no punches. He writes, and I quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place," referring to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, "with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." That problem was nicely captured by Anthony Kenny of Oxford University. Speaking of the standard Big Bang model, he said, "A proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." But surely that doesn't make sense, for such a conclusion is, in the words of the German philosopher of science, Bahnhof Kanischeider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been, I think, a cause which brought the universe into being. And we can summarize this argument as follows. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist, and here we would provide both philosophical arguments and scientific confirmation. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion follows necessarily. Now, what sort of nature must this cause be or have? From the very nature of the case, as the cause of space and time, this cause must be an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It has to be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we have to come to an absolutely first, uncaused cause. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Finally, I would argue, this cause must also plausibly be personal rather than impersonal. Just ask yourself the question, how else could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect with a beginning, like the universe? If the cause were an impersonal, mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. To give an illustration, if the cause of water's freezing is the temperature being below 0 degrees centigrade, then if the temperature were below 0 degrees centigrade from eternity past, any water that was around would be frozen from eternity past. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. So, if the cause is permanently present, the effect should be permanently present as well. The only way in which I can imagine that you could have a permanent, timeless cause and yet a temporal effect with a beginning, like the universe, would be for the cause to be a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will, who can therefore spontaneously create a new effect without any antecedent determining conditions. For example, a man who has been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up, and thus you would have a new effect arise from an eternally existing cause. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but I think to its personal creator. So this argument gives us a transcendent, beginningless, uncaused, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal creator of the universe of enormous power, which is, I think, a very full-orbed concept of God. All right, any question or discussion about this version of the cosmological argument? Yes? Yes. The question was about the multiverse hypothesis, which we'll talk more about when we come to the next argument. But some cosmologists have thought that perhaps our universe is just a part of a world ensemble of universes that exist. The interesting thing about the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is that it applies to the multiverse as well. So that even if there is a multiverse, it too can only be finite in the past and have an absolute beginning. So one of the striking features of this theorem that makes it so powerful is that it applies not just to our observable universe, it applies to the multiverse as well and requires that it have a beginning. Why couldn't you apply this argument to God? Very often it will be said by people, if everything has a cause, what is God's cause? This objection is based upon a confusion between the contingency argument and this cosmological argument. The contingency argument says everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. This argument says everything that begins to exist has a cause. And by conflating these two together, people have come up with the idea that everything that exists has a cause. And that's just a confusion. It's everything that begins to exist that has a cause. If something begins to exist, that means it comes into being. And given that out of nothing, nothing comes, that things can't pop into being from non-being, anything that begins to exist must have a cause. But God doesn't need to have a cause because he never came into being. He's an eternal reality. And this isn't special pleading for God. That's what the atheist has always said about the universe. Matter and energy are eternal. The universe has always existed, and therefore the universe doesn't need a cause. It's just that in light of premise 2, that explanation has now been called into question. So all this argument requires is that anything that comes into being or begins to exist has a cause. It wouldn't apply to an eternally existing thing. If you want to ask about eternally existing things, then go back to the contingency argument, which says that everything that exists has an explanation, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And I think this helps to clarify again why in that first argument, the contingency argument, I differentiated between explanations and causes. God, on that first argument, does have an explanation why he exists, but he doesn't have a cause. Right, that would focus then on premise 2. Is it true, then, that the universe began to exist? And in my thinking, that is the controversial premise in this argument. It's the second premise, that the universe began to exist. And that was where I anticipated the debate would mainly lodge. What surprised me, however, was the degree to which atheists, backed into the corner by the evidence for premise 2, took to calling into question premise 1, and many times asserting that the universe just came into being from nothing. And this, as I said earlier, is where Krauss's objection really applies, not so much to the contingency argument as to this argument, where he would say that physics can explain how the universe came into existence from nothing. But as the quotation from David Albert revealed that I read, Krauss is not talking about nothing at all. He's talking about quantum fields, which are physical stuff that are rearranged in different ways. The question was, if the infinite is just an idea that exists in our minds and not in reality, what about the infinity of God? Isn't God infinite? Well, it's certainly true that theologians have typically thought of God as infinite, and I would want to affirm that as well. But it's important to understand that in this argument, what I'm talking about is a mathematical concept of the infinite. It's a quantitative concept. The idea is, or concerns an actually infinite number of things. Can there be an actually infinite number of definite and discrete individuals or particulars? And the argument is that no, that would involve various absurdities, so that you cannot have an actually infinite number of definite and discrete particulars. But when we think about God's infinity, I think it's immediately obvious that God is not a quantitative infinite. We don't think that God is some sort of a composite made up of an actually infinite number of definite and discrete finite particulars. Rather, when theologians talk about God as infinite, they are talking about infinity as a qualitative concept, not a quantitative concept. And when they use infinity in this qualitative way, they're simply talking about God's superlative attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, eternity, aseity, necessity, moral perfection, and so forth. That's what they mean by the infinity of God. And none of those attributes involves an actually infinite number of definite and discrete finite individuals. In fact, I would actually say that there isn't any separate attribute of God called the infinity of God. I think God's infinity is just an umbrella term for all of these other superlative attributes. Just ask yourself, if you abstract away, take away omniscience, omnipotence, aseity, eternity, necessity, omnipresence, if you take those all away, is there some other attribute left over called infinity? Well, I can't imagine what it would be. There doesn't seem any content to it. It seems to me infinity in God's case is just an umbrella term covering all of his superlative attributes that I've listed. And therefore, it's a qualitative, not a quantitative concept that isn't in any way in contradiction to the idea that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. Louder, please. Eternity. Good question. Doesn't the eternity of God imply that God has existed for an infinite number of years, say, or an infinite amount of past time? No, I don't think it does. In fact, what I've argued is that God's eternity means his timelessness, at least without the universe. That God, as the creator of time and space, transcends time and space. So that God existing alone without the universe is timeless. And time had a beginning. Time is only finite. According to modern cosmology, it's around 13.7 billion years ago. And there simply is no such thing as 15 billion years ago or 20 billion years ago. That's pure imagination. But there really is no such time, because time began around 13.7 billion years ago. So God existing alone without the universe would simply be timeless. He wouldn't exist through an infinite number of years or an infinite number of hours. And that's why the question is meaningless. Why didn't God create the world sooner? If God had existed through an infinite number of years prior to creation, we could meaningfully ask, well, why did he wait so long? Why didn't God create the world sooner? But if time begins at the moment of creation, then I think you can see that's simply a meaningless question. There is no point sooner at which he could have created the universe. Time simply begins at the moment of creation. So even eternity wouldn't involve an actual infinity in God, given that he transcends time and created time. Well, yes, the point is that with regard to infinite quantities, inverse operations like subtraction and division can't be defined. Yes, I understand that. What that means is that there isn't any definite answer to infinity minus infinity. But when you think in physical terms, as I tried to do, like a collection of coins, there it's very clear that if you give away all the odd-numbered coins, you have taken infinity from infinity, and you have infinity left over. That's very definite and clear. On the other hand, if you take away all the coins greater than 3, you've taken infinity from infinity, and you've only got 3 left, and that's a definite result. And so the results are very definite when you're using concrete objects, and yet in both of those cases, it still remains a fact that you have subtracted an identical number from an identical number and come up with non-identical results. And that strikes me as metaphysically absurd.
But that's strange. Why absurd?
Well, because if you have identical quantities and you take away identical quantities, you should have an identical remainder.
With finite numbers, yes.
But, well, yes, but then that ought to question, I think, the existence of an actually infinite number of things. That you can do all sorts of things with these infinite numbers that seem to me to lead to results that are absurd, like subtracting identical quantities from identical quantities and getting non-identical results. And it doesn't refute that to say, well, but if an actual infinite could exist, then you could do that. That's indisputable. That wouldn't be a good illustration if that weren't true. The question is, can such a thing really exist? Could you really have an infinite number of coins that would result in these sorts of conclusions? And I think it's plausible that this is metaphysically impossible. And this is just one illustration of a manifold number of different illustrations of the nature of the actual infinite that I think make it plausible to think that it doesn't really exist. Yes, the question was, isn't the evidence that the universe is infinite?
How everything will disappear?
Excuse me?
Please tell me how everything physical will disappear. Everything which is will become to none. This is my question, because if you take your argument that infinite does not exist,
Yes.
this concludes to the fact that the universe should disappear in a finite number of years.
Oh, you mean in the future?
Yeah, future.
All right. Well, let me address it, but let me also address another question that's relevant that I thought you were getting at, and that was the spatial infinity of the universe. Does the universe go on forever, or do you come to an edge or something of the universe? And in fact, there is no evidence that the universe is infinite in this spatial sense. All the evidence is consistent with the universe not only being finite in time, but also being finite in space. And you wouldn't come to an edge of the universe if the universe is finite. The universe could have the geometry of the surface of a sphere, for example, like the surface of the Earth, which is finite, but if you go around the Earth, you never come to an edge where you fall off. You'll just come back to where you started again. And similarly, the geometry of the universe could be spherical like that, so that it would be finite and yet unbounded. Now, what about the future, though? If time goes on forever, if the universe goes on forever, wouldn't that be an actually infinite number of things? All right, let me address that question about the infinity of the future. Here, I think it is important to differentiate between two concepts of the infinite, the actual infinite and the potential infinite. According to Aristotle, actual infinites never exist. Infinity exists only in potentiality. For example, if you take any finite distance, you can divide it in half, and then in half again. and then in half again. And that can go on to infinity. And what Aristotle would say is that that finite distance is potentially infinitely divisible. It is infinite in the sense that infinity is a limit which you can endlessly approach, but at which you will never arrive. And that's in contrast to the idea of an actual infinite, where you have an actually infinite number of definite and discrete finite individuals that make up this collection. The notion of the potential infinite, which is Aristotle's idea, dominated in mathematics right up through the 19th century and is the role of the infinite, say, in calculus, where infinity is just a limit. The idea of the actual infinite was pioneered by Georg Cantor and is the role of the infinite in set theory, which thinks of sets, like the set of natural numbers, as having an actual infinite number of members in these sets. Now, how is this relevant to the question about the future? What I would say is this: if time is dynamic in the sense that the future does not yet exist, but is a realm of pure potentiality only, then what that means is that the series of events that have occurred at any time is always finite, but increasing toward infinity as a limit, so that the number of events from any point in time toward the future is always finite, but growing. That is to say, it is a potential infinite. And I agree with Aristotle that there's nothing objectionable about a potential infinite. So I would differentiate between the future and the past in that respect. If the universe is beginningless, then there have actually occurred an actually infinite number of events. But if the universe will go on forever in the future, the number of future events will never be actually infinite. We will never arrive at infinity. It is infinite purely in the sense of potentiality. It will go on and on forever, but will always be finite, but growing toward infinity is a limit. I think it is consistent if you differentiate between the actual and the potential infinite. The argument is against the existence of an actually infinite number of things. The past clearly cannot be regarded as potentially infinite if it is beginningless. For the past to be potentially infinite, the series of past events would have to be finite, but growing in a backward direction. It would have to be finite, but growing in the earlier than direction, which is contrary to the nature of temporal becoming, which is always forward. It's in the later than direction. For the future to be potentially infinite simply means from any event in time you take, the number of future events will always be finite, but growing toward infinity. But there never will be an actually infinite number of events. So I think that the argument is quite consistent. The past cannot be potentially infinite. The future can be potentially infinite. The future cannot be actually infinite on this view of temporal becoming. And the past, I would argue, can't be actually infinite either on the basis of these considerations. How can I call it potentially infinite only? Because on this view, temporal becoming is real. It's very, very important to grasp this point. Many philosophers of time and physicists think that temporal becoming is illusory, that temporal becoming is an illusion of human consciousness. And they think the future is just as real as the present and the past. They would say reality is a four-dimensional manifold, and that the future is stretched out like a line. It's out there, and we have the illusion of moving along our space-time path into the future, when in fact temporal becoming like that is merely a subjective illusion of human consciousness. This argument presupposes from start to finish a view of time that is called a dynamic view of time, or a tensed view of time, which differentiates in a metaphysically significant way between the actuality of the past and the mere potentiality of the future. So your objection would be a good one if you held to a static, tenseless theory of time according to which the future is real and exists. Then these arguments would imply that there has to be an end to the future and a finite future. But if time is tensed and dynamic, then it's a significant difference that allows us to say that the future is merely potentially infinite.
Can I take it the other way around? Are you saying that matter will cease or will cease not to exist?
Am I saying the matter will cease or not cease to exist? I'm saying that this argument has no bearing on that question. The argument has no implications as to whether matter will cease to exist or not.
When time appears, matter appears.
Excuse me?
Time appears, matter appears. Matter has no.
Right, and this argument says nothing about whether the future is finite or infinite. The argument is consistent with the future going on forever or with the future coming to an end tomorrow. It just doesn't have any relevance. All right, now you're asking me a question about the philosophical community. I would say I would be one of a small number of philosophers who think that philosophically the idea of an infinite temporal regress of events is metaphysically impossible. But when I look at the reasons why my colleagues disagree with this, I am singularly unimpressed. I find that most of them have never really grappled with these concerns in any deep way, and that most of the objections are easily answered. And I've been very gratified to find a number of philosophers in recent years have come around to the position that I'm defending. And I'm thinking, for example, Alexander Proust, who is a brilliant mathematician and philosopher at Baylor University, who quite reluctantly has said, I've come to think that Craig is right about the finitude of the past. And also Robert Koons at the University of Texas would be another example of a philosopher who has also come to embrace this view. And then there are other less prominent philosophers as well. So you're quite right in saying this is a minority view, but I don't think truth is to be determined by counting noses. I wouldn't define the locution begins to exist as has a finite past, but I think they're mutually implied or mutually entailed. I think that they're coextensive, even though they don't mean the same thing. The way I define begins to exist would be to say that x begins to exist at t, for some time t. X begins to exist at t if and only if x exists at t, and there is no time prior to t at which x exists, and x does not exist timelessly. That, I think, explains or explicates what we mean by x begins to exist. Now, that will be coextensive with the class of things that have a finite past, namely things that have not existed for infinite time but have existed only for finite time. And so with respect to premise one, I would say whatever begins to exist in the sense in which I just defined it has to have a cause given a dynamic view of time, once again. Or whatever has a finite past must have a cause given a dynamic view of time. Why is that? Well, because on a dynamic view of time, according to which temporal becoming is real, things come into being at the first moment at which they exist. On a static view of time, in which time is just stretched out like a line, then I don't think it is obvious that things would have to have a cause, because to say then that an object begins to exist just means that it has a front edge, so to speak. And I wouldn't see that there would need to be a cause of that front edge any more than a meter stick has to have a cause of the first centimeter. It's just the edge of this thing. So if you have this static, tenseless view of time, then it's not obvious, I think, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. In that case, what we should do is go back to back to the contingency argument and ask, wow, why is there this four-dimensional, tenselessly existing spatiotemporal object rather than nothing? And look for an explanation of the existence of this entity. But given, as I am persuaded, that temporal becoming is real and not illusory, it seems to me that this is a very powerful argument because it's based on the idea that things don't just come into being out of nothing. The things that come into being have a cause, and anything that is finite in the past has a first time at which it exists and therefore has come into being at that time. So, as I said, from start to finish, this argument presupposes this dynamic view of time, both in the causal premise 1 and in some of the philosophical arguments for premise 2. And if you're interested, I have defended in my published work extensively the objectivity of temporal becoming and this view of time. For example, in my book, Time and Eternity, I have surveyed the arguments for and against the reality of temporal becoming and argued that temporal becoming is not an illusion but is something that's real. Yeah, the question is, how can we say that out of nothing, nothing comes if we don't have any examples of nothing? Now, I think what we need to keep in mind here is that by nothing, we don't mean something. It's not as though there was a state of nothingness prior to the origin of the universe and the universe popped into being in that state. We mean that the beginning of the universe was not preceded by anything. So to say that the universe came into being out of nothing is simply to say the universe came into being without a cause. That the origin or the cause of the universe, or rather the origin of the universe is simply an uncaused event. And that, I think, we have plenty of experience to say that that doesn't happen. We never see things popping into being without causes. Everything that begins to exist in experience has a cause of some sort. So I think that we have overwhelming universal experience in support of the premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And it doesn't require us to have some sort of experience of nothingness, which is, again, reifying this idea of nothing and making it into a thing. I've also given other arguments for the first premise, too. For example, if something could come into being uncaused, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into being uncaused. Why doesn't Beethoven or beer or bicycles just pop into being uncaused? Why would it only be a universe that can pop into being uncaused? If things can pop into being without causes, then anything and everything ought to be popping into being without causes, because there couldn't be anything that would discriminate that only some sorts of things could come into being that way, because if it's really uncaused, if there's nothing that causes it, then just anything and everything ought to be able to pop into being uncaused. So it just wouldn't make sense to say, well, universes can do this, but not Beethoven, for example. So I think we've got every reason for affirming premise 1. It is surely more plausible than it's contradictory. And I think that when atheists attack this argument by denying premise 1, that just shows the intellectual desperation, I think, to which they're driven. If the price of avoiding theism is to affirm that the universe just popped into being without a cause, then I think atheism is philosophically bankrupt, because that is literally worse than magic. In magic, at least, you've got the magician, right? But on this view, it's worse than magic. There's no explanation, no cause at all for the universe popping into being. Oh, what would be the best arguments against this? Now, I'm going to give a talk later on in this conference on the worst arguments against this. Why do I do that? Well, because most of the arguments you hear against this are really bad. They're really awful. But it would seem to me that if I were an atheist and wanted to avoid this argument, what I would do is affirm the tenseless view of time, that temporal becoming is illusory, and that therefore the finitude of the universe in the past doesn't require a cause to bring it into being, because the universe never really came into being. It just tenselessly exists as this four-dimensional manifold. That would be, I think, the best atheistic response to this argument, would be to deny the theory of time on which it's predicated. With respect to the philosophical and scientific arguments for premise 2, I think I would say what this gentleman did. That's just the nature of infinity. The infinite is just strange, that's all. And just live with it. Get on with it. That's the way it is. And for the scientific evidence, I think there, about all you can do is just try to punt to the future and say, well, science is always provisional, and maybe this will be overturned in the future. And so even though the drift of the current evidence is against the universe being eternal, I can hope and hold out for this being overturned in the future. But that's about, I think, the best, honestly, that the skeptic can do in response to this argument. Yes, Hawking would be one example of a cosmology which is non-standard, in that he adjusts the standard model, which begins in a singularity, a point that is a boundary of space-time, and he gets rid of the singularity by introducing imaginary numbers into his equations for the time variable. And that has the effect of rounding off the beginning of space-time, so that it's not like a cone which terminates in a point. It's more like a badminton shuttlecock, which goes down and then has a kind of hemisphere at the bottom. But what's striking about Hawking's model is that it still affirms the finitude of the past, and therefore the beginning of the universe. The beginning is a non-singular beginning. It's not a singular boundary point, but it is still a beginning of the universe. And as I'll explain in my talk on Stephen Hawking that I'm giving later in the course of this conference, in his book, The Grand Design, Hawking admits this. He comes right out and says this, that on his model, this represents the beginning of time and the beginning of the universe. So I take Hawking's model to be supportive of premise 2. He is an ally in presenting evidence in favor of premise 2, not an adversary. He supports premise 2, that the universe began to exist. He simply offers a model that is a non-singular beginning to space-time, rather than a singular beginning as you have in the standard model. Yes. So we've surveyed so far a contingency argument for God's existence as a metaphysically necessary personal cause of the universe. We looked at a cosmological argument for the existence of God as a first uncaused personal creator of the origin of the universe. We now want to turn to the teleological argument for God's existence. And the cutting edge of the current discussion of the teleological argument concerns the so-called fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. During the last 50 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent, interactive life in the universe depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually, given enough time, intelligent life forms like ourselves might evolve somewhere in the cosmos. But in fact, we now know that intelligent, interactive life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a delicately balanced, complex set of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to a precision that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. And this fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are given mathematical expression, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. And these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these fundamental constants. Secondly, in addition to these constants, there are also certain arbitrary quantities, which are simply put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy, or the balance between matter and antimatter in the early universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, then the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. And this is what is meant by the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. To give some examples of the fine-tuning of the universe, gravity, the gravitational force or constant, must be fine-tuned to around 1 part out of 10 to the 36th power in order for the universe to permit intelligent, interactive life. The so-called cosmological constant, which explains the acceleration of the universe, as well as the early inflation of the universe, is fine-tuned to around 1 part out of 10 to the power of 120. The initial distribution of the mass and energy in the universe, that is to say, the amount of entropy in the early universe, has to be fine-tuned to around 1 part out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. 1 out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. A number which is so incomprehensible that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. So the universe exhibits this remarkable fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. And the question then is, what is the best explanation of this fine-tuning? Well, there are 3 possibilities which are discussed in the literature as explanations of the observed fine-tuning of the universe. Either physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, the first alternative, physical necessity, holds that there is some unknown theory of everything, or a TOE, T-O-E, theory of everything, that would explain why the universe is the way it is. The claim is that the universe had to be that way by physical necessity. There was really no chance, or little chance, of the universe not being life-permitting. By contrast, the second alternative, chance, says that the fine-tuning of the universe is due entirely to chance. It's just an accident that all of the constants and quantities fall into the life-permitting range, and we're the lucky beneficiaries. The third alternative rejects both of these accounts in favor of an intelligent mind behind the universe, which designed the universe to be life-permitting. And so the question is, which of these 3 alternatives is the best explanation of the observed fine-tuning of the cosmos? Well, the first alternative, physical necessity, seems extraordinarily implausible. As I've said, the constants and the quantities are independent of nature's laws. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants and quantities. So, for example, the most promising candidate for a TOE, or theory of everything to date, is superstring theory, or so-called M theory. And M theory allows for a cosmic landscape of around 10 to the 500th power different universes, all governed by our laws of nature, but having differing value of the fundamental constants. So that it does nothing to render the observed value of the constants physically necessary. Indeed, this cosmic landscape has become something of a phenom lately in cosmological discussions, and it's important to understand that this cosmic landscape doesn't actually exist. This just represents the range of values that M theory would permit the fundamental constants to have. And so it does nothing to render the observed values of these constants physically necessary. So what about the second alternative, chance, that the fine-tuning of the universe is just an accident? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe's being life-permitting are just so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. Even though there will be a huge number of universes lying within the cosmic landscape that are life-permitting, nevertheless, the number of finely tuned life-permitting worlds will be unfathomably tiny compared to the entire landscape. The proportion of worlds within the landscape that are finely tuned for the existence of intelligent life will be just an infinitesimal part of the entire landscape. So that a dart thrown randomly at the cosmic landscape would have no meaningful chance of striking a life-permitting world. Therefore, in order to rescue the hypothesis of chance, its proponents have been forced to adopt the remarkable metaphysical hypothesis that all of these possibilities in the cosmic landscape are actually realized. That is to say, that there exists a preferably infinite number of randomly ordered parallel universes, undetectable by us, but composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse of which our universe is but a tiny part. And somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes like ours will appear by chance alone, and we happen to be living in one such world. And this is where the heart of the current controversy lies. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The cutting edge of the debate over the fine-tuning today is the intelligent designer hypothesis versus the world ensemble hypothesis as an explanation of the fine-tuning. There are, however, at least two major failings of the world ensemble hypothesis. First of all, there's no independent evidence that such a world ensemble exists. Nobody knows if there are any other universes at all, much less that these universes are infinite in number and randomly ordered in their constants and quantities. Moreover, recall from our second hour today that the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to the multiverse as well. The multiverse itself cannot be infinite in the past but had a beginning. Therefore, since the multiverse is finite in the past, it may well be the case that it has only generated a finite number of universes in the world ensemble. And therefore, there's no guarantee that a finely tuned universe has yet appeared anywhere in the world ensemble. So that even positing a multiverse doesn't guarantee that a finely tuned universe has yet appeared in the ensemble. Secondly, and more fundamentally, I think, if our universe is just a random member of a world ensemble, then it is unfathomably more probable that we should be observing a much different universe than the one that we do observe. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has pressed this objection very forcefully. For example, in his book on The Road to Reality on Contemporary Physics, Penrose has calculated that it is inconceivably more probable that our solar system should just fall together through the random collision of particles than that a finely tuned universe should exist. In fact, he calls it utter chicken feed by comparison. It is so much more probable that the universe, or our solar system rather, should just come together by the random collision of particles in comparison with the probability of the existence of a finely tuned universe. So, if our universe were just a member of a randomly ordered world ensemble, it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing an island of order no larger than our solar system. Observable universes like those are inconceivably more probable than finely tuned universes, and therefore simply much, much more plenteous in the world ensemble, and therefore should be observed by us. Indeed, the most probable observable universe in the ensemble would be a universe in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observes its universe, but not a universe which is finely tuned for the existence of observers like us. Or again, if our universe were just a member of a randomly ordered world ensemble, it's incomprehensibly more probable that we ought to be observing extraordinary events like horses popping into and going out of being through the random collision of particles, or pink bunny rabbits beating on bass drums, popping into existence and going out of existence through the random collision of particles, because events like that are simply incomprehensibly more probable than the existence of a finely tuned universe. Observable universes like those are much more plenteous in the world ensemble than worlds which are finely tuned for embodied interactive observers like us, and therefore they ought to be observed by us. Since we do not have such observations, that fact therefore strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. On atheism, or naturalism at least, it is therefore highly probable that there is no world ensemble. Therefore, it seems premise too that the fine-tuning of the universe is due neither to physical necessity nor to chance. From which it follows 3, therefore it is due to design. And thus, unless the hypothesis of design can be shown to be just as improbable or implausible as physical necessity or chance, design is the better explanation and therefore should be preferred. Now, some detractors of design will say that the design hypothesis is in fact implausible, and just as implausible as physical necessity or chance. For example, it is sometimes said that on the design hypothesis, the existence of the designer himself remains unexplained. It's said that an intelligent mind also exhibits complex order, so if the universe needs an explanation, then the designer also needs an explanation. And if you say, well, the designer has no explanation, then why not say the same thing about the universe, that it has no explanation for the observed fine-tuning? This objection, I think, however, is based upon a misconception of the nature of explanation. It's widely recognized in the philosophy of science that in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Indeed, positing such a requirement would lead immediately to an infinite regress of explanation, so that everything would become inexplicable and science would be destroyed. So, for example, if archaeologists were digging in the earth and they came across things looking like tomahawk heads and pottery shards, they would be justified in inferring that these are not the chance products of metamorphosis and sedimentation, but that these are artifacts of intelligent agents, even if they had absolutely no idea who these agents were or how they came to be there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. And in exactly the same way, the design hypothesis, being the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe, doesn't depend upon our being able to explain the designer. That can simply be left an open question for future inquiry. Moreover, the complexity of a mind behind the universe is not really analogous to the complexity of the universe. Certainly, a mind's ideas may be complex, but a mind itself is a remarkably simple entity, being an immaterial entity which is not composed of parts or pieces. Moreover, properties like intelligence, consciousness, and volition are not contingent properties which a mind could lack. Rather, they're essential to the nature of mind, so that they must be possessed by a mind. So, postulating an uncreated mind behind the cosmos is not at all like postulating an undesigned cosmos with all of its contingent and variegated constants and quantities mysteriously fine-tuned for life. So that I think that the hypothesis of a designer behind the universe most certainly does represent an advance in simplicity. It is a much simpler hypothesis in terms of the entity postulated than the contingent and variegated universe. And therefore, it seems to me that the design hypothesis is superior to the hypotheses of physical necessity or chance, and therefore is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. So this argument will give us a personal, intelligent mind which transcends the universe and the laws of nature and is responsible for nature and its laws, as well as the values of the constants and quantities exhibited by those laws. Any comment or question then about this argument for the existence of a designer? All right. Now, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking, doesn't science presuppose a kind of methodological naturalism which would exclude this kind of hypothesis? Is that right? Okay. It's very important to see that this argument, as a philosophical argument, is not committed to what goes under the name intelligent design, which people like William Dembski, Michael Behe, and others have propounded. What Dembski and others propound as ID, or intelligent design, is a program which challenges the methodological naturalism of modern science and offers design as a scientific hypothesis. And this philosophical argument, which I'm offering, is in no way committed to that program. I am not offering this as a scientific hypothesis as part of this sort of intelligent design program. This is a philosophical argument. And as a philosopher, I'm not constrained by the methodological naturalism that some think modern science is committed to. So even if it's true that in virtue of its methodology, Science cannot conclude to an intelligent designer of the universe. That just does nothing to say that I, as a philosopher, much less as a human being, cannot draw such a conclusion. So, I would say that as a philosophical argument, this is a good argument for a designer of the universe, but I am not suggesting a reform of science in order to say that scientific hypotheses ought, or supernatural hypotheses ought to be a part of science. That's an open question. I'm not taking any position on that issue, and therefore it's just not relevant. That's a very good question and a very insightful one, because I think most people don't understand the commitments of intelligent design as a scientific reform program, to which I, as a philosopher, am not committed. I just don't have a position on that to take here. Yes, you want to follow up? Well, to say that, you're challenging the methodological naturalism of science, right? And you're free to do that. I am sympathetic with that, but this argument doesn't require that you do that. I'm not suggesting a reform of modern science in doing this. I would say something similar when I argue for the resurrection of Jesus. Some people say historians are methodologically committed to naturalism. They can't seek supernatural causes. And what I would simply say is that, however the historian might be professionally constrained by such a methodological naturalism, I am not constrained by such a thing. As a philosopher, I'm perfectly free to posit what causes I want, and as a human being, I'm free to draw these inferences, even if, as a historian, one is methodologically inhibited from drawing such an inference. So even if a scientist couldn't draw this inference, it just does nothing to invalidate the inference. Yes, good point, good point. I'm going to talk about that in my lecture at this conference on Richard Dawkins' arguments for God's existence, because Dawkins adopts this world ensemble hypothesis to explain fine-tuning. Dawkins admits that the fine-tuning is real. He says it's almost miraculous, in fact. He also rejects physical necessity. He quotes Sir Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, who says that these are not physically necessary, these constants and the values they hold. So Dawkins adopts the hypothesis of chance. But he recognizes the odds of the fine-tuning occurring by chance alone are just utterly trivial. So in order to give purchase to the hypothesis of chance, he adopts the world ensemble hypothesis. And he's acutely sensitive to the objection that this violates Occam's razor, because it postulates causes beyond necessity. Occam's razor says only postulate such causes as are necessary to explain the effect. And in this case, it would appear that the causes that are being postulated are, as Dawkins puts it, an unparsimonious extravagance. And he's very, very sensitive to that charge. And he tries to escape it, I think, unsuccessfully in a number of ways. But here's what I think he should have said. I think you should say that Occam's razor is not violated if you can identify a simple mechanism which will have the byproduct of producing a world ensemble of universes. And if you can do that, then you have not postulated anything that is unparsimonious, because the multiplicity of the universes is just the byproduct of a single, simple explanatory mechanism. The challenge then for the defender of the world ensemble hypothesis is to identify such a mechanism. And Dawkins isn't able to do so. Probably the best explanatory mechanism would be some sort of inflationary scenario where there is a sort of mother universe which is a false vacuum that is expanding, and then there are bubbles of true vacuum that form inside of this expanding mother universe, and our universe is one of these bubbles that form within the overall mother universe of expanding false vacuum. I think that's probably the best shot that the world ensemble defender can have. But then it runs into the objections that I raised. I didn't object to the world ensemble hypothesis on the basis of Occam's razor, as you say, but rather on the basis of these two other arguments, particularly Penrose's argument. So the question will be, with regard to Occam's razor, can the defender of chance come up with a simple mechanism to generate the many worlds with all of the variegated constants and quantities? That will be the challenge for the defender of the chance hypothesis. He points out that this fine-tuning concerns just the initial conditions of the universe. But there are examples of fine-tuning much later in the existence of the universe in order for life, at least on Earth, to be physically possible. And this is also the stuff of intelligent design literature arguing for the existence of some sort of a designer. What I like about the fine-tuning argument is that it does an end run around the whole, that's a football term for those who aren't familiar with it. That is to say, it goes around, circumvents the whole emotionally loaded question of biological evolution and Darwinism by going right back to the initial conditions. And you can say to the Darwinist, I grant you your theory of evolution. I give it all to you. You're right. But what about the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe? For evolution to take place anywhere in the cosmos, you have to have this finely set table in advance that needs to be explained. And any additional improbability about the origin of life, the origin of consciousness, the origin of sexual reproduction, biological complexity, that just layers on more improbability to be explained by the opponent of design. So that's just icing on the cake as far as I'm concerned. This argument alone, I think, gives you an intelligent designer of the cosmos, and it will simply be reinforced by any evidence that you want to adduce based upon biological complexity and the origin of life. Now, there's nothing in this argument that would allow you to infer the infinity of the designer. I don't think that you'll get that out of this argument. This will simply give you a designer and fine-tuner of the cosmos. But whether he's infinite, I don't think you can deduce from this argument. In fact, this won't give you a metaphysically necessary being. As many people have noticed, it won't say anything about the moral attributes of this designer. He could be an absolute stinker, for all we know. So one of the features of these arguments is that they go together to build a cumulative case for theism. And this one, I don't think, does anything to show that the designer is not finite. But whether there are other finely tuned universes, I think that's up to the designer. In fact, you noticed my conclusion about the many worlds hypothesis. I said, on atheism, there probably is no world ensemble. Now, that's a careful statement because I think the best hope for the world ensemble is theism. If there is a designer, he could have created other finely tuned worlds or other worlds that are not finely tuned. So I think it's theism that actually gives you the best grounds for believing in a multiverse or a world ensemble, because once you've got a transcendent designer, he could well have created other worlds. And we're not in one by random accident, we're here by design. Yes. I think there are no doubt quite a number of philosophers who would challenge the second premise of the previous argument, the cosmological argument, that the universe began to exist. So both premises of this argument have been attacked, but I don't think their arguments are very good.
How do you answer that if they come up with the argument?
Well,
The world can be
Oh, were you not here when we discussed this argument? What?
I was late because of
Oh, okay. Well, then you gotta listen to what we said. I would give philosophical arguments against an infinite regress, and then appeal to cosmological evidence for the beginning of the universe. And that scientific evidence is very powerful. I didn't mention, but let me bring it in here. This January, just a couple of months ago, this January, at Cambridge University, a conference was held celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking. And at this conference, Alexander Vilenkin presented a paper which he co-authored with one of his students on the beginning of the universe. And Vilenkin was quoted as saying the following: all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Now that's a remarkable statement. Vilenkin did not say the evidence for a beginning outweighs the evidence for the universe's being beginningless. No, he didn't say that. He said all of the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. So if you were to ask me, well, what evidence is there that the universe is eternal and beginningless? I don't know what you would appeal to. As far as I'm aware, there just isn't any evidence that the universe is beginningless. There is none. There are only certain models that try to escape the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, but there's no evidence for them. So all of the evidence, as Vilenkin says, really is on one side of the scale. So granted, scientific evidence is always provisional, it's always tentative, but nevertheless, it's very clear which way the evidence points. All of the evidence is on the side of the scale supporting the fact that the universe began to exist. Yes?
what's the reason why they believe in the multiverse?
What is the reason why they believe in the multiverse? This is a good question. Sometimes I think it will be to avoid the existence of a designer. In order to explain the fine-tuning and rescue the chance hypothesis, theorists will appeal to the many worlds hypothesis. On the other hand, I think there are independent reasons that could be given, or there are models that could be given for belief in a multiverse. For example, on certain inflationary scenarios of the universe, you could say that there will form these bubbles of true vacuum within the expanding false vacuum, and that these would be like mini universes within the whole. The problem is there isn't any evidence that these models are true. You can craft these models, but there isn't any evidence for these models. They remain simply conjectural or speculative. But nevertheless, these models would provide some independent justification for multiverse hypotheses, independent of considerations of fine-tuning. Well, now that's to confuse the multiverse with this cosmic landscape. Remember I said in M theory, it predicts this cosmic landscape of around 10 to the 500th power, different universes governed by our laws of nature, but having different values of the constants. And some people think that that landscape is actual, that these worlds actually exist, when really all it is in string theory is a range of possibilities. It's a range of possible values of these constants. What you need to do is to marry M theory with inflationary cosmology to get these bubbles of true vacuum within the expanding false vacuum, and this marriage of M theory to inflation will be an attempt to actualize these possibilities and make them real universes. So the reality or actuality of the worlds in the cosmic landscape will depend upon this marriage with inflationary cosmology. All right, let's address those two questions. If you remember William Dembski's design filter, the way he infers to design is by eliminating the hypotheses of physical necessity and chance. So although I haven't used the word specified complexity, this argument is kind of formulated in the same way. It's inferring to design by eliminating the alternatives of physical necessity and chance. And then showing that the design hypothesis is not attended by comparable weaknesses or drawbacks that would prevent it being the best explanation. And I think when I did discuss the hypothesis of chance, Peter, I did take cognizance of the combination of physical necessity with chance. It wasn't just a bald assertion that, well, it happened by chance, but it was an attempt to talk about theories of the multiverse, the world ensemble, how it would be generated, and that is just to appeal to this combination of natural law, physical necessity, with chance. So I think in the way I presented it and fleshed it out, it is taking full cognizance of the fact that it is a combination of physical law plus chance. So the question is, by entertaining so seriously the world ensemble hypothesis, for which there is no scientific evidence, aren't we in, or could not be because it's beyond the reach of, it's non-causally connected with this, aren't we violating the canons of science? Well, let me say two things in response to that. First, I'm not entirely convinced that there could not be evidence of these other worlds. It's true that we don't have any causal contact with these other worlds. That's true. But if it could be shown that there is operating in the early universe a mechanism that would naturally generate, say, bubbles of true vacuum within a false vacuum, and that we are such a bubble, then that would give us, I think, justifiable grounds for inferring we're not alone, that there are probably other things out there that are the products of this mechanism. So I think it will come back again to, do we have good evidence that there is this kind of mechanism operating that would naturally generate not only our universe but others? But the second thing I would say in response to that is similar to the methodological naturalism issue. As a philosopher, I'm offering a metaphysical explanation, and therefore I don't feel inhibited by the constraints of science. And so I think I have to take seriously the metaphysical hypothesis of other worlds, even if it's not a scientific hypothesis. As a metaphysician, I think one does need to take cognizance of it. Otherwise, it would look like special pleading for God. How could you ignore the world ensemble hypothesis and yet champion the hypothesis of a designer beyond the universe? It would seem to me that would be special pleading. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, as we say in English. If you're going to champion a designer hypothesis, I think you've got to be open to metaphysical hypotheses of a non-design nature as well. All right, well, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back then and look at the next argument for God's existence. But I think these first three are rather related, and I hope you can see what a kind of cumulative case is being built here for a transcendent creator and designer of the universe. Even if one of the arguments taken individually is not compelling, all three of them taken together, I think, present a very powerful case that our world is grounded in a metaphysically necessary transcendent creator and designer of the world. So I take the cumulative force of these arguments to be much greater than the force of any one of them taken individually. In the next session, we will turn to an argument of a quite different sort, namely a moral argument for God's existence. We come now to our fourth argument for God's existence, which is a moral argument for God. If naturalism is true, then I think it's plausible that objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, what do I mean when I say there are objective moral values and duties? It's critical that we understand this term. To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that something is right or wrong, good or evil, independently of whether we believe it to be so or not. So, for example, to say that Nazi anti-Semitism was objectively wrong is to say that Nazi anti-Semitism was wrong even though the Nazis thought that it was right. And it would still be wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them so that everybody thought that the Holocaust was good. And the argument or claim here is that in the absence of God, moral values and duties are not objective in that sense. So, premise one of the argument is that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. This is a premise on which many theists and atheists alike concur. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, who was one of the most influential atheists of our day, admitted, and I quote, "If there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God." End quote. Instead of inferring God's existence, however, Mackie simply denied that objective moral values and duties do exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." End quote. Michael Roos, who is an agnostic philosopher of science, agrees. He writes, and I quote, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." End quote. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the advent of nihilism. That is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And like Mackie and Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens on this planet is objectively true. After all, given a naturalistic worldview, what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On a naturalistic view, some action, say rape, may not be socially advantageous. And so in the course of human development, it has become taboo in civilized society. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is objectively, morally wrong. Such activity goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. On the naturalistic view, there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. And thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong that imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is, premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. And there's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values and duties than the objective reality of the physical world. The reasoning of Michael Ruse at best proves that our subjective perception of moral values and duties has evolved. But if moral values and duties are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, then our gradual and fallible apprehension of the moral realm no more undermines the objectivity of that realm than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of that realm. And I think most of us recognize that in moral experience, we do apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties. Michael Ruse himself confesses in another context, and I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Now, reflect on that statement for a moment. Ruse here ascribes to moral truths the same logical necessity that characterizes mathematical truths. So actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, I think, are really wrong. Similarly, values like love, self-sacrifice, generosity, and tolerance are really good. But if objective moral values and duties cannot exist without God, and objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that therefore God exists. So I think on the basis of these two premises, one has a good moral argument for the existence of God. Any discussion about this argument for God's existence? Yes. What is the connection between moral values and God on premise 1? Traditionally, moral values and duties were thought to be rooted in the being of God. God provides a sort of transcendent standard by which human actions are measured and provides a kind of plumb line for saying something is objectively right or wrong or something is good or evil. But now remove God from the picture. There is no transcendent foundation for moral values anymore. All you have is this relatively advanced primate, Homo sapiens, on this planet, and moral values and duties on this view would seem to just be the byproducts of biological and social evolution, just as Michael Ruse says. And there doesn't seem to be any ground, any basis for thinking that these would be objective anymore. In particular, moral duties would seem to be very hard to explain. Why would this primate have moral duties to fulfill and moral prohibitions if there is no moral lawgiver to impose such duties or to make such prohibitions? It's very hard to understand how there could be objective moral duties in the absence of any sort of a moral lawgiver. Yes? Well, okay, the question was, when I'm talking about objective moral values and duties in premise one, I'm not talking about morality as a kind of social behavior or cultural behavior that is exhibited by, say, South Sea Islanders, which might be very different from, say, a European culture. But I'm not talking about just something that's an inner sort of feeling either. That's just as subjective. That would be to say, not that moral values are the products of social influences or cultural influences, but just the result of personal, individual preference or inclination, and that's just as subjective. So that was why I emphasized, I'm talking here about objective moral values and duties. And remember the definition I gave. These are values and duties which are binding and true independently of whether any person, any human person believes in them or not. And in the absence of God, it's really hard for me to see why the South Sea Islanders' values are inferior to those of the European Enlightenment rationalist. They're both just the socio-cultural byproducts of evolution and cultural conditioning. And how could one say his values are true and binding and that the others are not? In the absence of God, it seems to me we've lost any basis for the objectivity of moral values. So again, this isn't about a subjective sense of moral right and wrong or good and evil. This is an argument about the objectivity of values and duties. Yeah. All right, the question then concerns premise 2. On what grounds do we affirm that there are such objective moral values and duties? And my appeal here is simply to moral experience. I think in moral experience we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that are objectively true. Well, let me finish. And so, just as we believe that there is an objective physical world around us on the basis of our sensory experience, so I think we ought to believe that there is an objective moral realm on the basis of our moral experience. And any argument for moral skepticism that you might give, I could run a parallel argument for being skeptical about the deliverances of our physical senses, about the physical world around us. So I think that we are rational and justified in taking what our senses, whether moral or physical, what our senses deliver to us in the absence of some overriding defeater or reason to think that those experiences and senses are deluded. And I don't see any good defeater for our moral experience. The atheist philosopher Louise Anthony, in a debate that we had on this subject, put it very well. She is an atheist, is a moral realist. She believes in premise 2. And she put it so well. She said, any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values and duties themselves. So that it's perfectly rational to go with the objectivity of moral values and duties rather than with moral skepticism. And as you think about it, I think she's absolutely right. What could be more obvious than the fact that raping a little child is morally wrong? That this isn't a morally indifferent act, or that taking a little girl and cutting her face with a knife and mutilating her is to do something that is objectively morally wrong. That's not a morally indifferent act comparable to nurturing and loving and caring for her. So I think Louise Anthony is right that any argument against moral realism will be based upon premises which are less obviously true than the reality of objective moral values and duties themselves. And so I think we're quite within our rights in going with premise 2. And I find almost everybody does believe in premise 2. It's not hard in conversation to find examples by appealing to illustrations where people will say, yeah, I guess I guess I do believe that there are objective moral values and duties. And you can use religious examples. Say, do you really think that the Spanish Inquisition was not doing something morally wrong to round up Jews and persecute and kill them? Do you think the Crusades were morally neutral? If the religious right were to take over the government and incarcerate all homosexuals and begin to gas them and burn them in ovens, you think that's morally indifferent? And virtually everyone, I think, if you use examples like this, will come to admit the truth of premise 2, and quite rightly so. Right. Let me respond to that. One attempt to defend the objectivity of moral values without God in response to premise 1 would be what I call atheistic moral Platonism. Plato, you may remember, believed that there is a kind of world of or realm of ideas that exist objectively and independently of the spatiotemporal concrete world. And so someone might say that moral values like love and justice and compassion just exist. They're just ideal, abstract objects that objectively exist, and therefore we don't need God in order to ground these objective values. Well, I have 3 reasons that I don't think that atheistic moral Platonism is as good a moral theory as theism. Number 1 is, frankly, I find moral Platonism unintelligible. I don't even understand it. I can understand what it means to say that a person is just or a person is compassionate. But I have no inkling what is meant at all that justice or compassion just exist as abstract objects. I draw a complete blank. Things like justice and compassion and fairness and loyalty and kindness seem to be properties of persons. They're grounded in persons. But the idea that these things can just exist on their own, I don't even understand what that means, to say that justice just exists. And notice also on this view, presumably moral vices would then also exist as abstract object. Greed, rapacity, cruelty would also exist as abstract objects. So why should I be obligated to align my life with one set of these abstract objects rather than another? I can't see any good reason for that at all. So the first place, I just can't make any sense out of that view. The second objection that I would have to Platonism is that even though it offers an account of moral value, it doesn't give us an account of moral duty. Duties are our obligations or prohibitions to do certain things. And even if there exists abstract values like goodness, compassion, kindness, I don't see where there arises any moral duty on my part to be kind, compassionate, or good, rather than cruel, rapacious, or selfish. Duties seem to arise in response to moral imperatives, a command that you should do this and should not do that. And theism gives us that in God, a divine lawgiver who issues certain imperatives to us. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, thou shalt not kill, and so forth. And therefore we can make sense of our moral duties. But on Platonism, I simply see no grounds for thinking that human beings would have moral duties, even if there are these abstract values. And then the third objection I would have to Platonism is that it posits a coincidence that is incredible, namely, that the naturalistic realm should evolve exactly that type of creature who happens to conform to the causally unconnected abstract realm of moral values and duties. I mean, that is an amazing coincidence when you think about it. that this independent physical realm, through a blind evolutionary process, should evolve just that kind of being that corresponds to the abstractly existing, causally independent moral realm. It seems to me vastly more plausible to think that the moral realm and the natural realm are both under the sovereign, I want to say hegemony, but that's a word maybe some non-English users aren't familiar with, the sovereign direction of someone who is both the source of the natural realm, the creator of the universe, and of the moral realm, grounding moral values and duties. So theism has a kind of unity to reality that makes much more sense, I think, than atheistic moral Platonism. And so for those three reasons, I think that theism offers a better ground for moral values and duties, and it would make it plausible that in the absence of God, objective moral values and duties wouldn't really exist. What should you focus on to understand it? Well, let me ask you this first. Do you understand the logic of the argument? Do you see how 3 follows logically from 1 and 2? Okay, so that's clear, that the validity of the argument is clear. So then the question will be just the truth of the 2 premises. Now take premise 2. Do you think that certain actions that one might undertake are really right or wrong? That good and evil are not just illusions of human beings, but there really are moral differences between actions. Now these people who say they are not, why do you feel inhibited by that? Why not simply say these folks are wrong, that they're mistaken? Why should you let someone else's failure to see that raping a child is wrong make you doubt that it is wrong? I mean, those people are psychopaths, right? People who think that this is all right, they're literally psychopathic. Why would you let a psychopath's failure to see that raping little children is wrong make you doubt that it's wrong?
Yes, well, for example, I would say that abortion is wrong always.
Well, let's not. No, wait. You want to talk about abortion? I want to keep on clear cases. I'm not denying that there are moral gray areas where it's hard to discern which is right and wrong. This is an important point. Don't confuse moral epistemology with moral ontology. Moral epistemology concerns our knowledge of moral values and duties. Moral ontology concerns their reality. This is an argument about moral ontology, about the reality. It's not an argument about epistemology. So I'm very happy to grant that there are lots of difficult moral questions where it's hard to discern what is the right or the wrong thing to do. And it isn't always clear what my moral duty is. But nevertheless, there are lots of other cases that are very clear and where we, I think, do see objective right and objective wrong. And we do see that there are moral differences. And that's all you need for premise 2 to go through.
How can I distinguish between the gray areas and the very clear ones?
Well, I would guess it would be simply on the basis of moral experience. In moral experience, we see that some things are clearly good and others are evil, but then we have other cases where it's not so obvious. For example, I appealed to child abuse and rape as a clear case. But say cigarette smoking, is that morally evil? Well, some people might think so because it destroys a human being and is therefore immoral, but other people might not think that cigarette smoking is immoral if pursued in moderation, say. So I think we just don't have as clear a moral perception of the one as the other. But the fact that there are questions that are in the gray area shouldn't do anything to make us think that, therefore, there aren't cases where there are clear moral differences. Murder is sometimes all right. All right, this is a good question that is, I think, important to draw a distinction here. Notice that I have not spoken of absolute moral values and duties. I have spoken of objective moral values and duties. So I am not maintaining that a certain action is always wrong, that it's an absolute moral value. So in some cases, it might be morally justified to kill somebody else. But that would merely show that what is morally right and wrong is relative to certain circumstances. But to say there's an objective moral truth is to say that in those circumstances there is something objectively right and there's something objectively wrong to do. So I'm not defending moral absolutes here in the sense that the morality of an action is independent of the circumstances in which it takes place. What I'm defending is that in the circumstances, there are objectively good things to do, objectively evil things to do. So it isn't refuted by saying that murder can sometimes be right. I would agree with that. That's to confuse absolute with objective. I agree that the existence of God implies the reality of objective moral values and duties. But the argument isn't question-begging, because as I responded to this fellow's question, I don't define objective moral values as meaning rooted in the being of God or God-given or in any way appealing to God. Objective here simply means valid and binding independently of whether anybody believes in them or not. And there are lots of atheists who believe that morality is objective in that sense. I gave the example of Louise Anthony a moment ago. So to believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties doesn't beg the question in favor of theism at all. It's just to say that we have certain moral obligations, whether we believe it or not, that certain things are right or wrong, whether we think so or not. And the question will be then, what is the basis for that? And that's then when the argument will come in that the best basis for explaining that is a transcendent God who is the source of objective value and duty. But the argument isn't in any way question-begging. Well, I would go back to what I said in response to this fellow here. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. We apprehend this realm of objective moral values and duties. And any argument against moral realism, as I said, I'm repeating myself now, I could run a parallel argument about being skeptical about the external world. Now, again, okay, I think you're confusing subjective and objective. To say that we can perceive a realm of objective moral values and duties is not to say that our moral intuitions are infallible and that we never make mistakes. If that were true, moral improvement would be impossible. But I think that even though we have a fallible and gradual apprehension of the moral realm, that doesn't do any, that fallibility and gradualness doesn't do anything to undermine the objectivity of that realm. In my own personal life, to speak very personally, I have grown morally. When I look back at my attitudes as a young man to women, for example, I'm rather embarrassed about it now today because I think I did not clearly perceive certain things about the value and the right way to treat women that I would see today. And I think I have grown morally in that sense. I think that my apprehension of the moral realm has improved. It's not that moral values have changed, it's just that I was defective morally. I was like a nearsighted person, you know, who can't see very clearly maybe the writing on a distant street sign. But that doesn't mean that the writing isn't objectively there. So don't confuse our fallible perception of the moral realm with the objective reality of that moral realm. This argument is not in any way to suggest that our moral intuitions are infallible. Yes, that actually is very true. And this is a point that was made by the late Francis Schaeffer. I don't know if that's where you got your illustration. Francis Schaeffer invites us to imagine that every person when he is born has a tape recorder placed around his neck. and this tape recorder only operates when the person makes moral judgments. You were wrong to do that. It's a good thing that that happened. You were immoral in doing that. And it records all the judgments. And at the end of his life, then God plays back the tape to this person and asks him how well he's lived up to his own moral standards. Well, I think Schaeffer was making a different point than you are, but it's very similar. Namely, that in the way in which we behave, I think we show that we do believe that certain things are objectively right and wrong, particularly the way we react when people treat us in ways that we think are unjust or that we're being used. Then it brings out, in fact, that despite our lip service to relativism, I think we do have a deep commitment to the objectivity of moral values and duties. Now, that doesn't prove that they exist, but I think it would prove that moral relativism is unlivable, that it's a view that no one can affirm and live consistently with. It is the question was about Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, in which Harris affirms vociferously premise 2 of this argument, that objective moral values and duties exist. And I found the book very helpful in this regard. He just excoriates these pointy-headed intellectuals who say that there are no objective moral values and duties. And he says that, he gives the example of someone who takes a struggling, crying little girl and cuts off her genitals with an infected knife and then sews her back up again. He's referring to the Islamic practice of female circumcision. And he says, in a case like this, the only question is whether or not, or to what degree such a person should be punished for an action so morally abominable as this. And I think Harris is absolutely right, that it's very clear that objective moral values and duties exist based upon our moral experience. So the question will be, how successful is his project of grounding objective moral values and duties in something other than God? And here, I would really encourage you to watch my debate with Sam Harris at the University of Notre Dame last year on the question, are the foundations of morality natural or supernatural? And in this, I lay out 3 objections to Harris's moral theory, which I think are unanswerable. They are, one of them at least, is a knockdown argument. And I want you just to watch his response. I will simply say his response was weak, if not non-existent. He was not capable of defending his moral theory. In particular, I don't think he had any basis for identifying moral goodness with what contributes to the flourishing of sentient creatures, as he claims, or to human flourishing. He had no grounds for making that identification. And in fact, as I showed in the debate, he actually admits in the footnotes of his book that these cannot be identical, because we can conceive of a possible world in which the peaks of the moral landscape, the peaks of human flourishing, are not identical with the peaks of moral goodness. This would be a world in which evil people flourish and do well. And so he admits that there is a possible world in which the moral landscape and the landscape of human flourishing do not coincide. And on identity theory, if it's possible that 2 objects or things are not identical with each other, then they're not identical. And so this completely undermines his moral theory that moral goodness just is the flourishing of human or sentient creatures. So I think that Harris's moral theory is fundamentally flawed, and that he, if you listen to the debate, I think you'll find that he really couldn't defend it. Any other question? This is a good question. These arguments are independent of each other. You've noticed that. So you could reject some of them and still use others. They're all independent. And therefore, their cumulative power is very great. But one might ask, well, which one is the most effective? Which one is the most persuasive? My personal prejudice is the cosmological argument. I love the cosmological argument. Ever since I was a boy, I had this deep sense that the universe doesn't exist necessarily, that there has to be an explanation for its origin in the past. So I love the cosmological argument. But I have to say that my experience speaking on university campuses is that that argument doesn't really touch students deeply because they're not familiar with the scientific facts. The philosophical arguments are abstract and hard to understand, and so they can ignore it if they want to. But the argument that I find that really grips them and that they cannot ignore is this one, the moral argument. Because every day you wake up, you answer by how you live whether or not you think objective moral values and duties exist. By how you live, how you treat other people, you answer the question whether or not you think they have objective, intrinsic worth. And so this argument is really inescapable. And this argument, I think, therefore touches students very deeply. So I do find this argument, I think, to be the most effective of the arguments. I think many students would agree that in the absence of God, it's really hard to see any sort of basis for affirming objective moral values and duties. And yet, they do have a deep moral sense that things like tolerance are good, and that intolerance and racial hatred and discrimination against other persons are really evil. And so this argument has a powerful purchase, I think, with university students today. Well, in conclusion to this argument, notice how this supplements the other arguments. The other arguments give us a metaphysically necessary, transcendent creator and designer of the universe. This argument now reveals to us his moral nature, that this is going to be a being which is the ground in some way of absolute goodness and our moral duties and obligations. And so this provides a very powerful filling out, as it were, of the concept of God that is sketched by the other arguments. All right, our last argument to which we'll turn then will be the ontological argument, and we will discuss that after we take a 10-minute break. Argument, which is the ontological argument. Now, in order to understand this argument, you need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. By a possible world, I simply mean a way the world might have been. A possible world is just a complete description of the way reality might be. So a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of a concrete reality. It is just a description of the way reality might be. A world description. The actual world is the description that is true. The actual world is the description that is in fact true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that are not in fact true, but which might have been true. Now, to say that something exists in some possible world is merely to say that there is a possible description of reality which includes that entity as part of the description. So, for example, to say that unicorns exist in some possible world is to say that there's a description we could give of reality which includes unicorns as part of that description. To say that something exists in every possible world is to say no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in that description. So, for example, many mathematicians think that numbers exist in every possible world. That is to say, no matter which description is true, the statement 2 plus 2 equals 4 will be true, and therefore numbers like 2 and 4 exist in every possible world. So, with that in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in the year 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observes, is by definition the greatest conceivable being. If you could conceive of something greater than God, then that would be God. So by the very concept, the very definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So what would such a being be like? Well, he would be omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something which is greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them, including the actual world. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every logically possible world. So, if God's existence is even logically possible, he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. So, we can summarize Anselm's reasoning as follows. Premise 1, it is possible that a maximally great being, otherwise known as God, exists. 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 to 6 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers would agree that if God's existence is possible, then it follows that God must exist. So, the whole question is premise 1. Is God's existence possible? And here, I simply like to ask the unbeliever, what do you think? Do you think it's possible, at least, that God exists? The atheist has to maintain that it is impossible for God to exist. He has to say that the concept of God is logically incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square, which do not exist in any possible world. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't seem to be incoherent in that way. The concept of a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every logically possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent concept, and therefore possible. And moreover, as we've already seen, there are other arguments for the existence of God which suggest that God's existence is possible. For example, the contingency argument and the moral argument will give you a being whose existence is metaphysically necessary and exists in every possible world. So, I like to simply leave this question with the unbeliever rather than give some case for premise 1. I simply leave it to the unbeliever. Do you think that it's possible that God exists? If you do, then it follows logically and necessarily that God exists. And thus the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. All right, any comments or questions on this argument for God's existence? That's a kind of ambiguous question. And I know lots of philosophers who think that this is a sound argument, yes. In the volume that I and my colleague J.P. Moreland edited called The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, the philosopher Robert Modal has a defense of several ontological arguments for God's existence. So there are quite a number of contemporary philosophers who do think this is a good argument for God's existence. Now, maybe what you mean, though, is there anybody who has changed his mind as a result of this argument? And there, I'm not sure. That may well be the case that there... Well, actually, I guess I myself would be an example of that. I believed in the existence of God on other grounds, but I thought God was logically contingent. I thought that God was necessary in the sense that he's an uncaused, eternal, indestructible, incorruptible being. But I didn't think that God's existence was logically necessary in this broad sense. And it was through contemplating the ontological argument and the need for a grounding of the necessity of mathematical truths and other necessary truths that I came to see the soundness of this argument. So although I didn't move from atheism to theism because of this argument, I did move from thinking this was not a sound argument to God's existence to now believing pretty firmly that this is a sound argument. Now, has anybody actually moved from atheism to theism on the basis of this argument? There I'm not sure. When I was at Birmingham doing my doctoral dissertation on the cosmological argument, there was another student, a grad student named Ken Surin, who was writing on the ontological argument under the same supervisor, John Hick. And he told me that his doctoral, he had another supervisor in the philosophy department who was, I think, a Finnish metaphysician and logician. And this fellow was convinced, he became convinced that the argument for God's existence, the ontological argument, was sound. And I asked Ken, well, has he become a theist as a result? And he said, for him, it had no religious significance. He just came to the conclusion, yes, this is a sound argument, therefore maximally great being exists, yes, but I don't think he religiously connected with this being. But it did seem, at least, that he was convinced of the argument in terms of theism. So that would perhaps be an example of someone who has made that transition. But of course, the soundness of an argument, and I think even its cogency, doesn't depend upon how many people it's convinced. Yes, yes, let me respond to both. I think that the contemporary discussions of the ontological argument, contrary to the impression that's still held in German theology, is that the objections of Hume and Kant have long been overtaken and shown to be inconclusive. Kant thought that the argument failed because existence is not a property. Existence is not a property like being blue or being heavy or being composed of a certain number of particles. Kant thought that existence is not a property in that way, and therefore Anselm's argument didn't exist. But this version of the argument, which comes from Alvin Plantinga, doesn't treat existence as a property. So the Kantian critique just falls by the wayside as irrelevant. Even if it's relevant to Anselm's argument, it doesn't have any purchase against this argument. Hume, his objection was that necessity is a property of propositions rather than of beings, and that therefore it doesn't make sense to say that there is a metaphysically necessary being. Well, again, I think the vast majority of philosophers would just say Hume was mistaken about this, and in particular, a good many philosophers would say that, for example, mathematical objects are necessary beings. We've talked about this when we discussed the contingency argument. If there are objects like sets and numbers and functions, these plausibly exist metaphysically necessarily in every logically possible world. It would seem absurd to say that the number 2 just happens to exist in this world, but there are other worlds in which it fails to exist. If 2 exists, it exists in every logically possible world, and 2 plus 2 equals 4 is logically necessary. So I think contemporary philosophers are quite happy to acknowledge the coherence of the idea of a metaphysically necessary being. And in any case, even if it's propositions and not beings that are necessary, on this argument, the proposition, God exists, would be necessarily true. So even if you don't ascribe the necessity to the being, but to the proposition, still, the proposition, God exists, is a proposition that is true in every logically possible world, and therefore true in the actual world. So in that sense, you don't even need to say that necessity is a property of beings rather than propositions. You can frame the argument in terms of propositions quite nicely. Yeah. Well, this is what I think many of us have felt, is that it looks like a sort of trick, but I don't think it is. And perhaps one way to see that it's not a trick is by giving a sort of non-theistic ontological argument, say for the existence of numbers that I just mentioned. If it's logically possible that the number 2 exists, then it would seem to me that the number 2 exists in every possible world. That it's absurd to think there are some worlds in which there is no number 2, that maybe there's number 1 and then number 3, and there's a sort of gap and there is no number 2, or there just aren't any numbers at all. It would seem very plausible that if it's possible for the number 2 to exist, then it's necessary that the number 2 exists, and therefore the number 2 exists in every possible world. So the idea here is that with respect to beings which are allegedly metaphysically necessary, their existence is either necessary or impossible. But there isn't any middle ground. They can't be just contingently existing. For a metaphysically necessary being, it either exists in no worlds, a putatively necessary being. For a putatively necessary being, it either exists in every world or in no worlds. And so you have to decide, well, what do you think is the case? Do you think it exists in no worlds? Or is there a possible world in which this thing exists? If you admit there is such a world, then it's going to be in all of them, not just one of them. Pardon me? Why? Because the nature of metaphysical necessity is that it exists in every possible world. That's what we mean by necessary. Something is contingent if it exists in some possible worlds, but not all of them. Something is necessary if it exists in every world. That's what it means to be necessary. Something is possible if it exists in at least one world. Okay, well now, wait a minute. You didn't let me conclude my thought. I'm trying to unfold a thought here. So, this is a very, very typical response to the ontological argument, to construct parodies of the argument by showing it would lead to the existence of obviously ridiculous things that nobody believes in, like a metaphysically necessary unicorn, or in one of my debates, Victor Stenger suggested a metaphysically necessary pizza would exist in every possible world. Or in our debate with Andrew Kopson and Arif Ahmed at the Cambridge unit was suggested that I think something like the smelliest being possible. What's that? Yeah, the stupidest possible being, and therefore it must exist in every world. And I think what you can show in every case is that these parodies do not work because what they're postulating is a logically incoherent concept that therefore doesn't exist in any possible world. For example, a metaphysically necessary unicorn would have to exist in every logically possible world. Now, what is a unicorn? Well, a unicorn is a sort of horse-like creature composed of flesh and blood, occupying a certain spatial volume, having a certain mass. And such a being could not possibly exist in a universe in which, for example, there were no matter, or in which the universe was composed of a single black hole, a single singularity. Any object that existed in such a universe would not be a unicorn. So the idea of a metaphysically necessary unicorn is just logically incoherent. Similarly, with a metaphysically necessary pizza. A pizza is a certain type of edible food made out of dough and having certain toppings on it with cheese. And such a thing could not exist in every logically possible world because it could be eaten and therefore would cease to exist. And therefore it wouldn't be metaphysically necessary if it's a pizza. So the idea of a pizza which is necessary in its being is a logically incoherent concept. It would not be a pizza. Or the stupidest being possible, that's not a great making property, as Peter said in our debate, and therefore there's no reason to think that this is a metaphysically necessary being. So it turns out, upon closer examination, I think, that all of these attempts to parody the argument postulate entities which are not comparable to the existence of a maximally great being. They posit things that are, in fact, logical incoherencies that do not exist in any logically possible world. And therefore, premise one would be false with respect to them. It's possible that a metaphysically necessary unicorn exists. No, that's false. Yes. Well, what you would lose if you change maximally great to ontologically necessary is you would lose these other great-making properties like omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. And to be an argument for God, you need more than just an ontologically necessary being. Otherwise, you might get a number, say. So to get God, you've got to have some of these other properties in there along with ontological necessity. But notice the argument does not, and this is important to understand, the argument does not deduce God's existence simply from the definition of God. It doesn't say God is a maximally necessary being or maximally great being, therefore God exists. No, it doesn't do that. It infers it from the possibility of his existence, that this is a possible concept. So it doesn't just define God into existence by trickery. It doesn't just deduce God's existence from a definition. You have to have premise one, that this is possible for such a thing to exist. And that's why, for example, you can't just deduce the existence of a unicorn from a metaphysically necessary unicorn or a metaphysically necessary pizza. You can't just deduce that therefore those things exist. You've got to have the premise that these things are possible, that they're really possibilities. And that's where the defender of the ontological argument will attack those parodies. He will say, they're not real possibilities when you reflect on them. Yes? Well, no, I think that would tremble on being question-begging if you first assume the existence of God. But obviously these arguments do, as you begin to see, have a close connection with each other. Both the contingency argument and the moral argument, given that there are logically necessary moral truths, wind up implying the existence of an ontologically necessary being as the ground of contingency and as the ground of moral truths. So some of these other arguments also will give you a metaphysically necessary being. And that was why I said that gives you some grounds for thinking it's possible that such a being exists. These other arguments already conclude to it. So that could give you some grounds for thinking it's possible. But I think in and of itself, intuitively, we see that this is a coherent concept, and therefore one that's possibly exemplified. Right, you don't assume the existence of God in order to get to number 3. But you do need to assume the possibility of God's existence. That's number 1. So the idea is, it's possible that there is a being who is omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect in every logically possible world. And that's what it means to be maximally great. That's the definition of maximal greatness. And so 3 just follows by definition. Alvin Plantinga. He's the philosopher who formulated this version of the argument. He's probably the most famous and influential Christian philosopher living today. So he formulates the argument in terms of maximal greatness. Yes, yeah, there's nothing logically illicit with this argument. The only, really, honestly, as I say, 2 to 6 are pretty uncontroversial. The real controversy will be premise 1. Is it really possible that there be a being like this? Or is this being also like the metaphysically necessary pizza or the metaphysically necessary unicorn or something of that sort? That's the real question. It's going to be premise 1. Yeah, well, the question would be then, what content is there? Do you mean biological organisms? That's what we usually mean by aliens when we talk about extraterrestrial life. And in that case, again, such beings could not exist in a possible world in which there was no matter, say, or in which only a black hole existed. Now, if you denude the word alien of any sort of content, then of course we don't even know what we're talking about. It could be you're talking about God, and that in the language you're speaking, the word alien means the same thing that God does in English, or that Dieu does in French. So you've got to have some content to your words, which is why it's important to define your terms. Right. What this argument would imply is that that kind of a world is not really logically possible. That in fact, if there is a world in which there is suffering and evil, that somehow it needs to be morally permissible, that God would have morally justifying reasons for permitting the suffering and evil in the world. But there would be no logically possible world in which morally unjustified suffering and evil exist. That even though you could imagine such a world, it really couldn't exist. It's not really logically possible. Because if it's possible that there is such a being as this maximally great being, then he would have morally justifying reasons for permitting it. Right, yeah, we're assuming that, yeah, he's omnipotent, remember, omnipotent and omniscient and morally perfect. Okay, now 5 and 6 are not statements, they're inferences. That is to say, they are conclusions drawn from 1 to 4 by the rules of logic. So let's see how it would work. Premise 1 says, if it's possible that such a being, premise 1 is the statement. You said some are assumptions, others are inferences. Premise 1 is the statement, that it's possible that God exists. Then 2 says, if 1 is true, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. And then 3 picks up the conclusion of 2. If a maximally great being in a possible world, then it exists in every world. And then 4 picks up the conclusion of 3. If it exists in every world, then it exists in the actual world. So you have a chain of reasoning. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. If R, then S. P. Therefore, Q, R, S. And the rest follows. That's the logic of it. Well, it's a statement, as you put it, and the question, I think the question would be, what good reasons are there to assume 1? And I just hinted at reasons for assuming 1, namely that it's intuitively coherent. When you think about this idea, it's not like the idea of a merry bachelor or a round square. This is intuitively a coherent idea. So that would be some justification for 1. But then I really begged off discussing it further. I was content to simply leave it an open question to the atheist or unbeliever, what do you think? Do you think this is a coherent concept? Do you think it's possible that God exists? And kind of make him think about it a little bit, make him reflect on it. So I didn't give a robust defensive one. I just hinted at a defensive one. But I'm content to leave it up to the atheist to decide whether one is true or not. Right, I think that is the real question here, Peter, for the argument. And I guess I would just think that the intuition that a world of morally unjustified suffering is possible is sort of parasitic on the other assumption, namely that there is no, or that it's incoherent and impossible that there be a maximally great being. So that it depends upon your seeing that there is no such being. And in that sense, one has a kind of priority, I guess, to premise one over the other. But I do feel the force of that objection, and that would be, I think, probably the best that I could say, is that these other notions are parasitic upon the assumption that one is false. Yeah, such a person hasn't understood the argument. I know that's what they say. I hear you. But as many philosophers have pointed out, that person simply doesn't understand metaphysical necessity. If a metaphysically necessary being exists in any possible world, it exists in all of them. It's either all or none, but it can't be just some and not others. So that person who says that, well, this just shows that God might exist, hasn't understood the argument. He hasn't grasped yet the notion of metaphysical necessity. Okay. I forgot premise 7, therefore God exists, a maximally great being. All right, so on the basis of these arguments then, I personally believe that we have a powerful cumulative case for God. The contingency argument, a cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, and the ontological argument, I think, make it highly probable that God exists. And so the next time you're confronted with an unbeliever who says, there's no evidence for God, I would encourage you to bug out your eyes, open your mouth, and say, is that what you think? I can think of at least 5 arguments for God's existence.